Hello, I'm Ralph Sevenor. We're here at the California Alarm Association. It's December 2003. We're here on behalf of CSAA, Central Station Alarm Association, NBFA, National Burglar and Fire Alarm Association, and SIA, Security Industry Association. This is a cooperative project with the associations to provide a historical anthology of the alarm industry. With me is Charlie Darsh, and I'm going to actually introduce Charlie Darsh, and I'm very happy to have a friend of mine, Stanley Oppenheim, and Frank Mieners, who's been in the industry for many, many years. So Charlie, if I could ask you to open it up, please.
Frank, and by the way, this is an interview of Frank, who has been in the industry for many, many years. He has a background that all of us should envy. Frank, how did you get into the alarm industry, and roughly what year was that?
The year was 1955, and I had a friend who was a friend who was married to my wife's best girlfriend, and I needed a job. And he had one of these places where they installed alarms.
How old were you, Frank?
I was 23.
And where was that, Frank?
This was in Los Angeles, California.
And what company was
The
it?
company was called Protection Engineering Corporation. I believe they were a subsidiary of a company called General Plant Protection, which was a guard company.
Now, if that was so, beyond that, when you started beyond that point, was that company bought out by another company, or did you just move on to another alarm company?
Well, I took a hiatus for 2 years and went into the Army Medical Corps. Then I came back out, and in 1960 I joined American Fire Dispatch. That was Jerry Linder's company in Los Angeles. Some years after that, Protection Engineering sold out to someone else.
What did you do there
At
at Protection Engineering?
Protection Engineering, I was an installer, learned how to install fire alarms, automatic flow detector systems, sprinkler supervisory equipment, and a lot of direct wire burglar alarm systems. This was the only other Central Station approved UL alarm company in the city of Los Angeles. The ADT had, I believe at the time, 2 Central Stations, one in Los Angeles and one in Huntington Park. Ours was in South Central of Los Angeles.
Your next step after
The next step was American Fire Dispatch, going to work for Jerry Linder. I was primarily hired to install fire alarms because they didn't know how to install fire alarms. From there, I went to becoming installation supervisor. In 1965, that company was acquired by Baker Industries, changed their name in 1966 to Wells Fargo Alarm Services. And in 1967, I was made vice president, regional manager of the Los Angeles area. Jerry Linder and the other 2 partners, Tom Lene and Ralph Fidler, decided to go to Wells Fargo Manufacturing, which was a facility in Santa Monica. I stayed with Wells Fargo. As I said earlier, I had become vice president regional manager, which began my trips to the East Coast, and I was then responsible for Omaha, Memphis, New Orleans, and Los Angeles, and San Jose.
These were the operating
These
companies.
were the other acquisitions made by Wells Fargo. So I had Los Angeles, San Jose, Omaha, Memphis, and New Orleans. And at that time, we had regular meetings in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, was where the headquarters of Wells Fargo was at the time. So during that period, I believe I met Stanley, because I was also on the NBFAA board. Don't ask me what year that was.
Do you think you can roughly give us an idea?
Sometime in the early 70s.
Uh-huh.
Well, I'm pretty sure it was after I became president of the Western Burglar and Fire Alarm Association, which is the predecessor of the California Alarm Association. And it was during that time that I had been elected to the Western Regional Vice President position of the National Burglar and Fire Alarm Association for 3 or 4 terms. I
You were
forget.
still with Wells Fargo at the time?
I was with Wells Fargo at the time. In 1975, I went to work for George Weinstock at Moore Signal, and continued being active in the California Alarm Association, and also on the board of directors for the NBFAA. In 1981, Moore Signal was being acquired by American Protection Industries. It was at that time that I started looking around for other endeavors in the alarm business, and I had a friend in Santa Barbara, California, Herb Hennig, that I talked to about acquiring his company. Since I didn't have any money, I needed some partners, so I enlisted Bay Alarm. It was then in September of 1981 that I became partners with Everett Westfall, Bruce Westfall, Roger Westfall, and in security alarm service in Santa Barbara.
You spent the rest of your career?
I was there 10 years and finally retired, so to speak. Then went into consulting for another 10 years, and that brings us to today.
Stanley, I'm sure that you could ask some very pointed questions. And since you and he particularly were back some years ago.
Well, actually, one of the my early memories is that that Frank shared an interest in the history of the alarm industry early on, before others actually came on board. And interesting to note that much of the history of the alarm industry was lost by succeeding generations, not to be blamed, who just didn't recognize that that by not preserving the historical record of our industry would be lost forever. A few people, Frank being early on and being one of the very earliest, recognized that we were losing this heritage and that it needed to be preserved. And I also had an early interest, and I remember that was a common thread between us. I have a vivid recollection, and I'm able to actually precisely date it. It was in June of 1977 in New York City. There was a regional, in those days the National Burglar and Fire Alarm Association had regional meetings, and that was the Eastern Regional Meeting of the National Burglar and Fire Alarm Association in New York City. I can actually precisely set the date, and you'll wonder why. It was the 20th or 21st of June, and I'll tell you in a moment why I can do this with such precision of 1977. And I did a history presentation, a slideshow based upon, a lot of it derived from an early Edwin Holmes book. And I remember having a great discussion with Frank at that time about the history. To tell you why I was so precisely dating it, my wife gave birth to my second son, Joshua, and I remember literally getting home, sleeping for a few hours, because this, of course, was scheduled in advance, and with about 2 hours sleep, driving into New York and making this presentation with my son at that point only being 18 hours old. And that's why I was able to give such precision to the date. To that end, my question to Frank is, can you tell us a little about your interest in the history of the alarm industry? And I know that you have many pictures, many slides, etc., and pieces of memorabilia. From those era, what can you share with us?
Well, that's an interesting point, because had I not been from the West Coast, and had I not, in my travels with Wells Fargo, gone to Newark, New York, worked the strike in New York, been around some of the equipment there, Chicago also, when we acquired Central Watch, which was another Baker Industries acquisition in the mid-60s. If I hadn't had the experience of seeing the dynamic difference between equipments, I wouldn't have realized that there are all these antiques on the East Coast still in use.
Including me?
And that's when I started to have an interest in it. And
Now, you're saying that there were
Not
major
people-
changes here in
oh,
equipment?
as far as we were concerned, we were way ahead in technology on the West Coast.
Is that right?
For instance, in Wells Fargo meetings, technological meetings, Jerry Linder and his cohorts, Tom Lene at American Fire Dispatch, had developed electric transmitters for fire alarm service and gotten them listed. That was anathema on the East Coast, and especially with the Wells Fargo people. They thought everything had to be a wind-up clock with a spring in it. If it didn't have that, it wouldn't work. And that was a dramatic change, or an evolution of, of something, of the driving mechanism of a transmitter. Everything was still McCullough, so I speak of transmitters. But what really piqued my interest was Newark District Telegraph, because this place was ancient. It was truly a district telegraph office. And I'm sure at one time, because then I began to start researching some of the history, and ADT had district telegraph offices. In Los Angeles, they had equipment that we had found later on that said Los Angeles District Telegraph. So I knew about Newark District Telegraph, and some of the equipment was made of, most of it was made of wood. They didn't have plastics in those days. Nothing was made of metal, as far as the boxes or the containers, except for, well, even the fire alarm equipment was usually made in oak cabinets with brass interworkings. And that's what piqued my interest in the beginning in all of this stuff. Central stations were fascinating because they were still old. Nobody had computers. And in contrast, we had installed the first computerized central station system in Los Angeles in 1965. And that's, I think, what piqued Baker Industries' interest in this little company in Los Angeles. IBM installed their, what they referred to at the time as their 1800 computer, which I have pictures of, which was almost as big as this room. And it did very little. But that's how I became interested in the history of the industry. And then, as Stan said, I also received a copy of, what is the title of that book?
A Wonderful 50 Years.
Yes, yes. And there were some plates in there that I then copied, photographed, and blew up into large prints for display in some of the shows that we had. We subsequently put those on display at ISC shows, at California Alarm Association meetings, and so forth.
Is that when Max was involved with?
Sometime after that, I had, by that time I probably had, well, I had just had a habit of, well, my first trip to New York, as a matter of fact, to work the strike, in what year was that, Stanley?
Not sure. I'm not sure.
With Local 3, anyway.
For sure.
I had a brand new 35 millimeter Minolta camera, which unfortunately I left in the cab and went back to find it. It was no longer there. So my picture taking in New York had to be done on a rented camera for that trip. But I was always taking pictures of everything I came across. So subsequently now, well, I haven't taken many in the last few years, but I have probably conservatively 10,000 slides of alarm industry items, functions, people, and so on from 1955 until 1995.
Now,
Amazing.
you also collected some of the memorabilia, some of the antiques that I think you have also given to one of our companies.
The antiques that I collected were with the help of a gentleman by the name of Lou Walters, who happened to work for Wells Fargo, I guess you'd say purchasing at the time. He was able to abscond with, or whatever, with some of the equipment out of NDT, out of Central Station Signals, out of Sentinel in Philadelphia, which was another acquisition by Baker, Chicago Watch, all of this old equipment, and he sent me several pieces all of which have been, I kept for a long time. Just several years ago, since I didn't have any more room at home, I moved those to Jerry Linder's central station because he had a display area out in front of his office. In that group, there were, there was one NDT direct wire receiver that was simply a wooden box built on some formica with a meter in it and a couple of jacks.
Frank, what did NDT stand for, the N?
Newark District
Newark.
Telegraph.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought we went over that earlier, but the other one was a very large glass door wooden cabinet, if it still exists. I'd say 20 inches high, 8 inches wide, 8 inches deep, maybe 10 inches wide. You open it up, it had the ring back device inside that the central station would ring back the subscriber with to tell him everything was okay. It also had an additional telegraph key inside so the subscriber could ring the central station. These were unique to me because we installed very few direct wire systems in Los Angeles, primarily because of the distances involved and the cost of telephone lines. In New York, that was not nearly a problem.
It's amazing because we still retain some of those terms like rounds, the rounds of circuits back then, and it's just amazing how we continue even with the alarms. We have a 5-alarm fire, a 4-alarm fire, a 3-alarm fire. Question, and actually I must tell you this is a very exciting interview because we've got Charlie and yourself and Stanley and John Sargent all together, and really those are the experts in the industry for the history of the industry. So I'm hoping more people will grasp onto that.
I wish John were here because he was part of some of this and he had seen some of this equipment
Right.
before
Maybe you could spend a minute. Years ago, you had there was a gentleman that really patented or perfected the concept of ultrasonics, Doppler effect, and maybe you could spend a minute and just give me your recollection of that.
Well, we were at American Fire Dispatch a big user of kit ultrasonic. I don't know, and Sam Bagnall, who was the inventor, I guess, or adaptation. Ultrasonic was a German development that came about during World War II, which basically measured the change in frequency as one moved through an area that was saturated by a certain frequency. And if there was a certain frequency shift, this caused the receiver to denote that frequency shift and caused the receiver also to go on ballast, close a contact, and present an alarm. Well, this was a humongous piece of equipment in terms of today's technology. It had, I believe, 3 or 4 6SN5 tubes. Vacuum tubes. They were at least 8 tubes in the unit. Big transformer, 110 volt powered.
What year do you think that was?
That would have been in the mid-60s. We actually started installing those, I believe, in 1962. They were improved a bit, but never to the point of satisfaction. There was a huge problem with battery backup. If you wanted to get a UL certificate using ultrasonic, you had to have basically a bank of batteries with a big inverter that would convert the DC to AC and then drive the AC unit, which was bad in the first place.
That's because of the amount of current that drew.
Yeah, and the fact that you had vacuum tubes which were heat activated, and you had to, well, nobody knows about vacuum tubes anymore, but fortunately my early electronics
So back
covered
then,
that.
a serviceman would actually go with a tube set, one of those 5 tubes, and replace those
Typically,
tubes
he'd
also.
just go with them all and replace it.
Is
Well,
that
at least
right?
at our place, we'd throw them all out and start over.
Maybe there's a correlation that you were talking about the technology in the west of the United States was much more advanced, and perhaps one of the reasons was because the East Coast didn't want to change to newer technologies for fear, like you just cited, about the ultrasonics of the flaky tubes and.
Well, I can't speak for why they didn't want to change, or they knew that what they had worked. And if you broke a hard-drawn copper wire stretched across the floor or an attic, you were sure going to get an alarm. If you broke a trap that was very typical in those days, it was a black wire running across with a spade and a couple of, I forget what they would call the receiver end of it, but you kicked that off, you were going to get an alarm, there wasn't any question about it. Whereas with an ultrasonic, if it wasn't sensitive, the alarm wasn't going to be detected. If it was too sensitive, we were going to have a lot of false alarms, which is what really happened. Ultrasonic presented the industry with a lot of false alarms.
Now, if this equipment was manufactured, the newest equipment was manufactured in the West Coast, who were the leaders? Was it Tom Lennay? Were others that were the designers or developers of that equipment?
Historically, and this is where you have to go back to, except for Potter Signal and ADT, very little alarm central station equipment was available. People made their own equipment. In fact, in most cases, in central stations, alarm companies manufactured their own central station equipment. Morris was manufacturing their central station their central station equipment when they were in Cleveland in the early 50s, maybe even in the mid 40s. Wells Fargo wasn't in a position to manufacture anything because they had acquired these companies, the various companies that acquired. But ADT always made their own equipment until they decided to try some other method of manufacturing later on.
Holmes made their own.
Holmes made their own, I was aware of that. NDT made their own because they all had their names on it with plates on it.
But again, that's East Coast.
That's East Coast, but that philosophy transmitted to the West Coast to a certain degree. Even Bay Alarm made some of their own transmitters and equipment.
Correct.
So, American Fire Dispatch made their own equipment. My shop foreman made all the transmitters we installed up until the time that I would say through the mid-70s, because that equipment was not available to central stations. People didn't make transmitters that you could buy off the shelf until digital communicators come along.
You know, it's amazing because you think of the technology as we know it today in 2003, and back then they had to have woodworking shops, they had to have lathe shops. They effectively made their own teeth, code wheels, and in some instances, I believe, insulated their own wire.
Well, in the case of code wheels, that was another dramatic departure because almost all of the Eastern built color transmitters had metal code wheels. Still do.
Could you explain what a code wheel is for?
Well, yes. A code wheel is a device that rotates on an axis, and on the edge of the wheel, which is about 1.25 inches in diameter, there are little cogs that stick up. They go around and they wipe two blades of contacts. They open it, ground it, and then close it as they go by, and they go by in a sequence so that you can identify numbers from that sequence, like 2 space 3 2, and that's basically a code wheel.
Or count 232 today, as we know it in a digital communicator.
Yeah, that could be. This you have to remember, all evolved from the development of the telegraph in 1850, because of the telegraph key. They just adapted the telegraph key to a code wheel instead of using the telegraph key to send the signal identifying the sending transmitter. They used the code wheel after it was actually
electromechanical way of sending a signal.
right, and it was truly electromechanical.
I believe the term that was used for the day is that those contactors, what we were calling them brushes, they were brushes which would.
They
which
were,
open.
yeah, they. That was the primary responsibility of the serviceman, answering a service call where signals were spotty or jumping, was to clean the brushes.
Also, I might add to the discussion that one of the reasons that differentiate the East Coast from the West Coast is that one must recognize the population shift in the United States. The alarm industry clearly started in the East Coast because first that's where the large populations were.
Well, they said that's where all the thieves were.
Thieves were too.
Yeah, I read that, I know that. Where the large populations were, so historically the industry started there, that's where the large population centers, cities such as Boston and New York and Philadelphia had very large populations in the 1850s, where in the West and California the populations were relatively small. So much of the early technology was developed on the East because that's simply where the large population centers were,
And the density, is that
the large
because of-
density, the large densities were, etc. Of course, as the years went on, the United States, the population started to grow everywhere, and there was a population shift, and states such as California in the West have grown to have huge populations, but it just simply wasn't the case in the 1850s. So the birth of the industry took place where the large populations were in the East. And then Frank quite correctly stated, in the East, you had, again, the concentrations permitted direct wire, etc. And many of the early companies actually ran their own lines, something that was not possible in the West, where you would have a company like Holmes running their own line in New York and in other cities. Companies such as AFA would run their own lines in Boston and in New York and in Philadelphia.
Stanley, can you explain about running your own lines?
Certainly I can. Excuse me. In the early days of the industry, which would be in about the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and thereon, there was no telephone company infrastructure. There were no telephone lines because it predated the telephone companies. The alarm companies, and Holmes being recognized as the first and earliest of the alarm companies, actually literally ran their wires over building tops through the cities such as Boston and New York, from their alarm central station to their alarm subscribers. In the later part of the 19th century, the various cities began requiring these companies to put these lines underground in telephone, what was called subways. These were telephone ducts on the ground. But in any case, these companies maintained their own networks through the streets, and in fact, up to not as many years ago as you might imagine. I know that the Automatic Fire Alarm Company maintained a network in Boston. You would know better than I, Ralph. Up to relatively not that long
I
ago,
believe the 50s,
in the 50s or later,
perhaps.
or later in the 1950s, I believe even later than that, there was remnants. Of course, as the telephone company came and started to put their infrastructure throughout the cities, it was less expensive and easier to lease these direct wire metallic connectivity lines from the telephone company who had this vast infrastructure. But predating them, the alarm companies installed their own network of lines through the street and actually maintained these what we'll call low tension systems, low voltage systems in the various cities.
Now, wasn't that probably the reason that you had to make changes in the West Coast because of the differences, the size, the population
I believe
was
part of it.
much different than that?
Well, there were basically two reasons. One was the urban sprawl that you had in places like Los Angeles, in San Diego, even Denver. In San Francisco, you had an arrangement pretty much like New York City, and they still used a lot of direct wire in that city, and the municipal systems were, of course, all direct wire. But if you go to a city like Los Angeles, you had huge amounts of area to cover, and they didn't, for the most part, if there was a large insurance risk involved, then they might insist that you install a direct wire system. But underwriters then began to change requirements and allowing for let's say a jewelry store or some high risk facility to get a certificate, an underwriter certificate, by simply installing a bell, a grade A bell, and then supplementing it with a McCullough transmitter. Well, that was unheard of in the people, at least to the people I talked to on the East Coast, because they'd simply drop a direct wire in and put a grade AA direct wire line integrity system in. We had some of those, but only to those customers that were physically close to our central stations, because they simply couldn't afford the cost of leasing a line. And I don't know what the rates were. The rates were pretty expensive, but you paid for it by quarter mile as the crow flies. That and the fact that the industry was beginning to grow. There were lots of alarm systems installed that didn't necessarily involve anything to do with underwriters' laboratories or listing of the service. So many alarm systems went direct to police departments and sheriff stations in California, directly. There were no intervening central station of any kind. Or they would go to answering services. Now, I never ran across a situation like that on the East Coast. Generally there were a lot of them went directly to the police stations. In fact, there was an acquisition by Wells Fargo, and I don't remember the name of the company, but the gentleman who ran it was Vic Zahn, and some of you may remember him. But he had thousands of direct connected alarm systems into police panels at the police department.
Where was Dick Zahn located?
New Jersey.
New Jersey.
And wasn't it NDT his company?
He was involved with
Newark-
NDT, yes, and I think that was his company, but he kept the other operations separate. They subsequently formed a whole division of what they called Wells Fargo, I think, security systems or something like that. Then that group went around the country and took away from all the Wells Fargo branches all of their direct connects that they had, which did not make us managers happy.
Now, what happened with it? You were talking about that they had them in the answering services,
Police
and the
stations.
police
mainly.
stations.
Police stations.
There are many still there. How many I don't know, but they
You mean
were
the police connects?
the police connects, yeah. But Demco made this equipment for those police connects, and they were pretty crude. They also required a leased line, but it was a short distance from the protected premises to the local police department. It wasn't like going many miles to a remote central station. Many systems were combinations. They had a connection to the local station for monitoring openings and closings, and they would go to the police department for the alarm portion of it.
So let's take a step to 1970, for example, 72. Currier Smith comes along, one of certainly the founders of the digital communicator. Maybe touch base with me and take me through that whole process.
Well, to be honest with you, I think Wells Fargo, for the most part, stayed away from digital communicators, especially Currier Smith. And it wasn't until there was a gentleman up here in this Bay Area, and I can't remember his name. He developed a digital communicator that Wells Fargo became interested in. But it wasn't, I don't think we at Wells Fargo ever used digital communicators except on a very minimal basis. We were still using McCullough. Wells Fargo had developed what they called a line integrity transceiver that would put line integrity over McCullough that most companies didn't have. I don't think any company had it but Wells Fargo. This was a development by Tom Monet, who was then the vice president of engineering for Wells Fargo. One of Jerry Linder's previous partners. So at Wells Fargo, there wasn't much digital prior to 1975. I didn't really run into digital until I went to Morris, and that would have been in the late 70s. And Sescoa, I believe a Phoenix company, was the company that supplied us. So I remember that name that you just mentioned, which I cannot remember again.
Currier Smith.
Currier Smith. I had seen
purchased
those,
by
yeah.
ADT.
But we never used that equipment. So again, maybe that's just a separation from east and west again.
Was a McCullough circuit popular in the west here, the California area?
certain people made it popular. Those that could get away with it, like in San Francisco, everything was direct wire. Because you had short distances to run, you didn't have to pay the telephone company a small fortune to establish alarm service. Also, if you didn't have a central station, you had those kinds of competitors would set up in the police department or in an answering service, as the case may be. But in places like Los Angeles, McCullough was burgeoning. The companies that started up in the early, well, say late 50s, early 60s, everything for the most part was McCullough. When I went to Morris in 1975, I think we had 12 direct wire systems, everything else was McCullough. When I left Wells Fargo, we had like 600 direct wires.
Is that right?
Yeah. But we were also in South Central Los Angeles, which made a big difference. Where you were located made the difference. ADT had a full functioning central station in downtown Los Angeles that only serviced downtown Los Angeles. They had another one in Huntington Park that serviced that area.
And the distance was about what, between Huntington Park and South?
10, 15 miles.
Well, central stations in those days were based upon
Proximity.
Proximity to achieve telephone line, lease line economies. There was a period in the up to the 1960s, 1970s, even early 1980s in New York City, which is a geographically rather small city, which at no point is there more than 16 miles from the center of New York City to the outer ridges of the outer limits of the city. The Homes Electric Protective Company, which dominated the direct wire central station business up to that point, had 22 central stations serving this 5 boroughs of New York City, which is a it had 8 million people. It was a geographically not large area, based upon concentrating central stations where there were large groups of accounts to achieve telephone line economies. Now we have major companies such as ADT, which services millions and millions of accounts with 3 or 4 or 5 central stations in the whole United States. The Homes Company had 22 central stations in the city of New York alone, up to only.
It's my understanding, I never saw them, but they had more than one central station in one building.
Well, there was just expansion. There was 1 or 2 like that, and they would have thousands. And they would have thousands. Some of them would have thousands of direct wire accounts in a single central station. All direct wire. Homes effectively had no McCullough, which is again for the historical record, which is a telegraph party line type system where a telephone line would be looped in and out of several different premises in a general area, and the message, as Frank explained, would be sent to the central station by a coded wheel, which would send a unique coded number signal over this party line telegraph system. The Homes Company in New York did not use those, and which was, again, the Homes Company credited for being probably the first alarm company. All their alarms up to just about 20 years ago were direct wire, individual direct wires, using a slightly unique system unique to them.
Frank, in all of the years that you have spent in the industry, you might have either some anecdotal story or something that you could relate to us, something that could even be comical. Do you have anything that you might be able to bring us?
You should have asked me that question 3 weeks ago, and then I would have been prepared.
Well, let's see.
Well, how about some of the interesting and colorful people that you've met over the years? I'm sure some of them have made a lasting impression on you. Some of these early pioneers were very colorful. Do any come to mind that you want to come back?
Oh yeah, we had a large group of those kinds of individuals at Wells Fargo. Chuck Johnson in Philadelphia, Joe Prescott from Chicago Watch, Frank Cole also from Chicago Watch, who later
Did
became.
you work for him?
Yeah,
Did you work with him?
I was his West Coast regional manager at Wells Fargo. He later founded National Guardian. Seems like all of these companies, though, have gone back to ADT. In the mid-60s, ADT was well, the late 60s actually, it was 1968 in California anyway, where ADT was divesting itself of all of the revenue as a result of the Supreme Court case that caused them to do this. All of those companies that were formed, Burns, Wells Fargo was the main one, and I don't know, maybe Stanley knows of some others, but it seems like now they've all gone back to ADT and been reacquired.
You know, although this is a historical review, I'd like to hear your opinion on where perhaps you see the industry in 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years, A, and B, if you were to talk to someone who's just entering the business today, what would you like to tell them?
Well, I don't know if I would be a good one to ask what to do, because I don't know that in this case history repeats itself, because in the past 40 years, I think that technologically the industry has advanced so much, I don't think it will ever repeat itself. And there's so many new devices. For instance, we did not have infrared up until the late 60s as a result of the Vietnam War. We didn't use microwave until Dr. Palmer invented it here in California. I guess he invented it. Then that was combined with infrared, with infrared and with ultrasonic to create another false alarm device. But what would I tell somebody who is entering the business today? The main thing, and it has been a problem from what I can see in the very beginning, and that is false alarms, or unverified alarms as they now refer to it. You have police departments that simply are not going to respond anymore unless the alarms are verified. We have an unprecedented situation in Salt Lake City where a central station manager was arrested for dispatching on an alarm where he had already verified it, but somebody had determined that there wasn't an alarm after they got there. So, I mean, this is a huge problem. I don't see how the industry can continue to go ahead unless they can control it. Verification is one way. Also, but the flip side of that is the customers are demanding the service. They don't feel comfortable. Police cannot protect properties. I don't even know if it's in the moral code anymore to protect properties. If you listen to most of the liberals that are in the news media, you think that protecting property is almost a sin. You shouldn't be doing that. So it's a huge problem for the alarm industry. I think socially, in some cases, an alarm system sets you apart socially in another bracket. I think that's a huge problem. And the police don't want to hear that. They don't want to have any part of it, at least from what I can tell. I know that from my historical observations, in the 50s and 60s and early 70s, in our small central station in Los Angeles, it was not unusual for us to capture, with our alarm systems, 500 plus burglars every single year.
Out of how many accounts, Frank?
Less than 2,000.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Because when I left there, it was about.
What would you think your false alarm rate was at that time?
Oh, no one calculated it.
It was just.
We just did it.
Accepted. Is that it?
Yeah, and we did have our own people responding. In the early days, what started this association, the California Alarm Association, its predecessor, the Western Association, was the fact that we talked earlier about these direct connect alarm systems. They were going to the sheriff's department, where the sheriff was responding to these alarms that that this one company was installing in the sheriff's department. Well, it turned out that we learned that the sheriff himself had money in this company that was installing them. So that kind of congealed the industry into the Western Burglar and Fire Alarm Association.
So he was double dipping.
The other issue was in Los Angeles, and you'll hear it and see it in some old movies. A call would go out The code now, or used to be when they would dispatch on alarms, would be, for California, the code is 459 silent. 459 is the penal code, which applies to burglary. So when the police put the call out, they put it out as a 459 silent. Prior to that, they used to put it out as it's an ADT silent. When American Fire Dispatch or Morse or any of those companies would dispatch on a silent alarm, it would go out as we have an ADT silent at a certain address. Well, the association did address that, and the police commission and the police department changed their position on that, and that's when they changed it to 459 silent.
That's amazing.
But there were no local alarms to speak in Los Angeles.
So everything, when you say local, most everything was monitored then?
Everything was monitored. There were no local bells. There were no sirens. The technology for sirens hadn't come about yet. I believe in all the years that I drove around Los Angeles installing alarms in the late 50s, early 60s, I only saw one ADT bell box. And I knew where that was. It was on Verdugo Road in Los Angeles.
So it's that unique.
It was. At American Fire Dispatch, we installed bells, as did Morse. They did it differently. But we gave the alarm system a different name. We called it Security Alarm Service.
And that was
So it would
local?
be totally divorced from American Fire Dispatch, and it would be a local. So everyone would think that, this has nothing to do with American Fire Dispatch. It was such a, that was a low-class alarm system.
Amazing.
Do you remember back to those days when the tradition of manufacturing equitment began to evolve, and it was the beginning of suppliers? Of course, the Demco was an early supplier from back in New York, it started about 1929. You mentioned Potter in St. Louis, which was a early supplier.
Fru was another one.
Right. Do you recall buying from the Fru company?
Yes, we bought from Fru. We bought from.
Remember Mr. Fru? Did you remember?
No.
You remember? Go ahead.
I was not in the position to place those orders. Jerry Linder placed those orders, but we bought from Fru directly. AW Fru Company. We bought.
Do you recall what you bought from them?
No, things we couldn't get from a Demco.
Okay.
We
So
bought
you bought a lot of equipment from a Demco in those days?
a lot of equipment. Yes.
You dealt with Morris Coleman?
I don't remember the name, but when the 1300 photoelectrics came out, we
Oh,
put
yes.
in thousands of those.
Yes. With
And then-
the incandescent bulb.
Yeah, but our geniuses at American Fire Dispatch devised a power supply for them, so we could get away from the battery. But
1300 was the UL version of the 1200.
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's great. Well, Frank, I really want to thank you for allowing us to speak, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm hoping we can keep you in the industry for many, many years to come.
That's right.
It's been a pleasure being here and answering your questions, and it went much easier than I thought it was going to.
Thank you, Frank.
But we only covered about 50% of it.
Well, we'll come back. We'll be back.
Thank you, sir.
You know one thing?
Thank you.